Well, I got almost 9 o'clock. It's 9 o'clock somewhere in the world, so we're going to go ahead and start and remind everybody to keep all those in our thoughts and prayers that are out sick, recovering from various illnesses. Brother Moody is back today. Kevin, he still has his kidney stones, but he's here. Emma's still recovering from surgery. Jeremy Clonch is still having a lot of congestion. Got an email this morning, the Mays are out dealing with COVID going through the family. It's great to see some back that's been out. Diane, Terry, who else did I see? Oh, Janice is back, and the Howards are all with us this morning feeling better, so let's just keep all those in our thoughts and prayers. Anybody else on the list of the, I'm sorry, Pansy still, you want me to say that where she can hear me? Brian says she's better, but she's still barking. I don't know if that. The Halls, he still has his upcoming procedure, so keep those in your prayers. Anybody else? Brother Kirk, would you lead us in a prayer, please? This will be the book that we're using for the quarter. It says Marriage and Family First Quarter. If you didn't get one, there's still some out on the table. Last Sunday, we did the first lesson, which was titled The Heartbeat of Marriage. And then today we'll be going through the second lesson. Now, I'm not going to follow this exactly as it's outlined in here, but I'll try to get to and cover all those points, plus I've got some extra stuff to throw in that I think will be beneficial. To start with, it says the most intimate of relationships, and we know that God created the marriage when he made Eve for Adam, and that's in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. And we know that the Bible is replete with instructions on how married folks are to treat each other and to get along, so we need to follow those instructions. And then item 2 says divorce is out of control. Now, I'm going to give you a number, but the number I'm going to give you for divorce is a number that is, I'm not going to say it's 100% accurate, because when you're dealing with statistics, you have to have a baseline. And here the baseline gets skewed because the divorce rate is based on the marriage rate. How many people get married? Now, how many people get divorced? So as the marriage rate has declined over the years and the divorce rate has gone up, that's not a real true representation of actual divorce per year or percentage. So like I say, it gets a little bit skewed. However, the numbers are going to be pretty close. So anybody have an idea of how many people in the United States get divorced every year? Of those that get married, how many get divorced? And there's where your skew comes in, because the average length of marriage in the United States is 8.2 years. So if you're looking at how many people get married this year, then you got to go 8.2 years down the road to see how many people get divorced to get your totally accurate number. But am Am I making any sense? We got an accountant in here. Is that, am I getting close? You understand him? So, anybody got an idea of what the numbers, the government says, the percentage of people get divorced? The last year of statistics that I could find that I would count accurate, the government is always lagging 2 years behind when they do their statistics. So around 2018, 44.6% of every marriage ends in divorce. So the statement that divorce is out of control, I would consider that an accurate statement, that it's out of control. And then when it looks at the reasons, it says many married couples are miserable, dissatisfied, thinking happiness is unattainable. Well, let's slip over to the second page on that says, item number 4 says, how the seeds of destruction are often planted before the marriage. So, if there's going to be X number of people get married every year and X number of people get divorced every year, a good percentage of those, the dissolving of the marriage starts before the marriage. How does that happen? How can the seeds of destruction often be planted before there is even a union? They disregard God's plan. Now that will go into a whole lot of what we're going to discuss, and it is absolutely true. But how many of you know people that have dated someone, but they pretend to be something they're not? When they're dating, what's the first? If you go back to your high school years, and for some of us that's a long way, but if you go back to your high school years, for you guys, when you saw a girl that you liked or thought you wanted to date, what did you try to do? You put on your best face. You tried to impress her. And as people get to know each other, if that facade stays in place, then when the marriage takes place and then they relax and they're really who they are, then you got a problem. So where I go with number 1 there is, before a marriage, the people dating, the people that are getting to know each other, honesty goes to the first place. I'll go back to when Andrea and I, our first official date. Now, we was in college, Harding College in Arkansas, college then, university now. We hung around together. We knew something about each other. I knew I wanted to get to know her a little bit better, and I was hoping she wanted to get to know me a little bit better, so I asked her out on an official date. But when I asked her out on that date, I didn't have any money. I think I had 60 cents. And the English department was having movies, and the one that we went to see was Midsummer Night's Dream, and it cost $0.25 to get in. Well, if I got 60 cents, that's 50 cents to get in, that leaves me with 10 cents. Cokes at the time at the rec hall was 10 cents. Uh-oh, I don't have enough money to get us into a movie and buy a Coke. So I was right up front with her. I said, asked her to go to the movie with me and said, I can either pay your way in the movie or I can buy you a Coke afterward. I don't have enough money to do both. She paid her way into the movie. So our first official date was Dutch. But, I could have gone and borrowed money from my cousin. I could have borrowed a dime from him or something like that. But right up front, she knew if she was looking for a man with deep pockets, it wasn't me. So I think when couples are dating, that honesty is the number one thing. You have to know what you're getting, because if the rules change afterward, there's problems. The second part of that is culture that we live in today has caused major problems. How many people do you think in the United States, a percentage, live together before they're married? And this gets into what Brother Clonch had pointed out about the first category and or category before this is people violate God's plan. They don't follow God's plan. God's plan is not see somebody that you think you like and move in and live together and then get married. God's plan is that you get to know each other, you're compatible with each other. The honesty comes in, and then there's that bond for life. Because how many people do you know that have gone into a marriage knowing that they were going to divorce? How many people go into a marriage knowing or thinking that they have a companion for life? Isn't that what most people are looking for? A companion for life? How many of you know that there are different categories of marriage in the United States? Now, we're not getting into the gender realm here. I'm just talking about the overview of marriage. There is a thing called traditional marriage. Some states have what they call a covenant marriage. What's the difference between a traditional marriage and a covenant marriage? There's also, people want to define it as a civil marriage and then a religious marriage, divided up that way. If we're thinking about the whole world and not just from the Christian viewpoint, what's the difference between all of those? What is the difference between a traditional marriage and a covenant marriage for those states that have that?
A traditional marriage is a contract for life.
A traditional marriage in the states that have the traditional and the covenant marriages is that the marriage can be dissolved for any reason that meets one of the state requirements. The covenant marriage in those states are that they are married for life. What's God's plan? Married for life. What's the difference between a civil marriage and a religious marriage? Some people, if they get married by civil authority, it's basically a contract that can be broken. A religious marriage shouldn't be, but there's, even if people are married in a civil union, civil authority, by God, there's still that religious aspect. There's that life aspect. If you go back a few years, a couple of decades now, people started, before they got married, they started having contracts drawn up that was called prenuptial contracts. Why in the world would anyone ever choose to marry someone but make them sign a prenuptial contract before that marriage? What is marriage? We discussed this last week. It's the leaving father and mother and cleaving to, bonding to, uniting with, and becoming one. If I had Andrea sign a prenuptial contract, where is that melting together and becoming one. We get married, what's mine's mine, what's yours is yours.
No, you got it wrong.
By civil authority, the way the contract works, but by your definition, what's mine is hers and what's hers is hers. Okay. But when you get all this into play and try to pick out all the different ways that a person can be married, they're automatically setting up an escape clause. If it don't work clause. Yes, sir.
Most fail to realize that God's law for marriage is for everyone, regardless if they recognize the scriptures or not. It's still a plan because he goes all the way back to the beginning and says, before all this happened, these things were put in effect.
It goes back to the very beginning, and the first verse of the Bible, in the beginning, God created. It was the second chapter that God basically instituted marriage. God created Eve for Adam, giving the example of the unity. When in Scripture was the first example of somebody not following God's plan? Anybody got an idea? Back up a few years. Go to Genesis 4, verse 19. Genesis 4, verse 19. Somebody read that, please. Genesis 4, verse 19. Did God institute marriage for a threesome, foursome, fivesome, ownsome? When God instituted marriage, it was 1 and 1 equal 2 make 1. 7 generations later, Lamech takes a second wife. This is the first example in the Bible that's used. It could have happened before, don't know. I'm just saying that this is the first time it's in print that it happened, was 7 generations later. But before the flood, we've already got people not following God's plan for marriage. Another problem is that 66% of the people who get married today in the United States live together before they get married. That is against God's plan. And what are some of the problems that come up, that arise out of this? You would think that if a person chose to live with somebody and then get married, it would make the marriage more stable, wouldn't it? There is a larger percentage of divorce from those that live together before marriage than those that don't. If you're going to ignore God's law in one respect, you're going to ignore God's law in another respect. Now, what are some of the really big issues that happen today prior to a marriage that affects people? And I'm going to bring in one that's been in the news lately in the Supreme Court, and you've got basically two sides to this battle. And even though they're not equal, the smaller group raises more fuss than the larger group, but it has to do with abortion. Why am I bringing up abortion when we're talking about marriage and problems in marriage before marriage even takes place? Anybody got a clue how many children are born today out of what we call wedlock, out of not married. The birth rate of children to a single parent, not in a mother, father. I think it will astound you. 39.6% of the babies born today are born to a single woman with no husband in the picture. What's God's plan for raising children? A mother and a father. I mentioned abortion. In 2019, 86% of the abortions were to single mothers or to be mothers. 86%. So what if they had waited until they got married? That number would go down drastically, wouldn't it? Do you know the major reason? Now, if you watch TV or listen to it on the news and all like that, with all these people that scream and holler about women's rights, it's my body, it's my choice, my right to do this. What is one of the major issues that they always come up with as an excuse for an abortion? Rape, incest. Do you know what percentage of abortions there were a couple of years ago? Again, we're dealing with 2019, based on rape. I wrote these down so I would remember them. 0.5%. 0.5% of the women that had abortions was due to rape. Do you know the highest percentage reason for having an abortion? 25% of those that had an abortion was because they're not ready for a child. If they're not ready for a child, why put themselves in the position to have a child? And that's the least crude way I can think of saying that. 4% of the abortions were because it would interfere with education or career. 7% not mature enough to raise a child. If you're not mature enough to raise a child, you're not mature enough to be put in a position to have a child. There's other numbers there, but that gives you an idea of what's going on. So people who want to play married before they get married create the situations of abortions, disease. One category was 23% of them say they can't afford a child. If you look at high schools today, it used to be when I was in school that if a girl in high school, not married, got pregnant, their family would send them off to live with a relative. They'd send them off somewhere. I'm not saying that that was the right thing to do. I'm just saying that's what happened. But today, you look around at the high schools and the kids that are pregnant, that are not married, it's sort of like they're wearing it as a badge of honor. And who's going to raise that child if have that child when they're in the 10th, 11th, 12th, some of them 9th grade? It falls back on grandma, grandpa, or mother, father, but in the current situation, there's not a father around generally. So, major problems come about when you don't follow God's plan. When you try to play married before you get married. Yes, sir.
Just in our country, in just the last 30 years, look how much things have changed. I know when I was younger, none of my friends came from single family parents. That was just, I think there was one lady in our neighborhood that was divorced, and talk about that. When my kids were little, most of their friends were single family, single parent family. And now it's just, now every form you fill out, it's got who's your significant other, blah, blah, blah. It's not, are you married? It's all these other names for it.
Yes, sir. Which really creates difficulties.
To be fair, most of our friends were from the church.
Well,
It's interesting in Ephesians that it starts with putting on the new man. Then it talks about walking in love. It talks about walking in the light. And then it goes on to talk about marriage. And then it goes on to talk about children. God has put these things in an order that is not to be disturbed or changed for a reason, because God knows best. And when we try to change that order, it makes things very difficult.
I agree with you totally. And one reason I'm bringing all of this in is, even though we're on a different subject, and I'm sort of worked this in, is so many of our young folks today, church folks, date and marry non-church folks. So these numbers have to, this is some areas that we need to work on to make sure that they're aware of all of this. Any other questions or comments on where we are so far? So we're going to back up now to number 4, the one that we skipped, which we was talking about how the seeds of destruction are often planted before the marriage, and we've talked about being honest when dating, and that 66% live together. And number 8 says when relationships before marriage are on a physical basis, they show disregard for God's plan. Thus, they will not experience happiness as God intended. As Brother Terry has already pointed out, you would think that those that live together before marriage would be more successful than the other way around, but more get divorced. So that follows exactly what this fellow says here, that if you show disregard for God's plan, you will not experience the happiness that God intended. If you did, they would stay married. Also, it says that 80% of the living couples, once they marry, end up divorced. So it is a really, really huge number. Why do you think it is that people who live together before they marry have more difficulty than those that wait for that portion? Yes, sir. Distrust?
We can live together before we're married. There's no contract. But as a man, if I have this lady and we're out of marriage, and we're living together, do you think I can trust her? I don't think so. By the same token, it goes the other way too. There is no trust, because what have you violated? You violated God's plan first. You violated the social agendas. There's no trust between the two of you. It may start with a little bit of trust, but it'll end up with none.
Let me ask you a question then. If I living together happily because they think they want to get married at this point. You know, they got to be happier. They want to take the next step, right? Why do they want to take the next step? If they're living together happily, why get married? They've got all the benefits of marriage already.
Especially now, because if you live together, it can be covered under insurance and everything else now.
I think there's a search or a seek for, even with the way the country is and moral, I guess, decline, if you want to call it that. You know, I think it's always been that way under the sun, right? It says that somewhere in the Bible. But there is still a search or a feeling of we need legitimacy. You know, I've known a lot of people that are live-ins that aren't married, and that man, when he's talking about that woman, will refer to her as his wife, even though she's not, in certain circles or in front of certain people. And I think they do that because maybe there's some level of shame or a feeling of needing that qualifier. But of course, if you have already trounced God's plan as far as what marriage means, then I think the book says there's no respect then for that marriage contract as God would see it as a contract. And so it's a lot easier for that marriage to be dissolved, because, you know, what changes really? You were already living together. You can still live together afterward. What does it matter whether you technically have the paperwork or not?
And that's where I was going. What is a marriage? What makes a marriage? Is it that, as you call it, a contract, either verbal or written? You see, in the Bible, it does not show any ceremonies. When Adam married Eve, was there a ceremony? God brought Eve to Adam. Lamech took 2 wives, don't say how. Isaac took a wife, went into mother's tent. They were married. Married in God's eyes, which is totally different than man's eyes, but in God's eyes, when a man and a woman commit to each other to live as man and woman, man and wife, that's the marriage. And for various reasons today, we have to do things more legal or more technical. There has to be ceremonies and such. But if you look at the people who live together before marriage, in some states, they are already considered common law married. So when you get to this, God's plan is that man and woman get to know each other, and as soon as they make that decision that they're going to, in the United States, you have the ceremony, and you stand there and you promise to love forever, sickness, health, the whole routine. That is a permanent, unbreakable bond, except for one reason. We won't even go there today, but God put it in place that man and woman should live together forever as one. So, what are some of the problems that come up after marriage? Well, we're still on before marriage. Number one, after all, aren't they trying on the shoe before buying it? This is getting into some of his rating. Dating and engagement, apart from the physical, is the trying on. Do you go to battlefield before deciding to join the army? Similarly, cannot know in sexual sense until vows made. Number two, though, sums it up. Live-in couples show a disrespect for the institution of marriage. I think that one sums up the whole thing right there. What we're talking about when they decide to get married, If they have been living together and then they decide to get married, does that marriage really put any legitimacy to it?
They're not bound by bond. If Diane and I were living together and I got mad at her for some reason, I could walk off. Legally,
Yeah,
but not in God's eyes.
but not in God's eyes.
If marriage is supposed to work, you've heard people say, you have to give 50-50. No, it's 100. That makes marriage work. And the man needs to keep his mouth shut when the lady is expounding an idea, and then she will ask him what he's going to do.
As we get to section B on that, it says that they become more disrespectful. If you violate one law flippantly, it's easy to do it with others. It says marriage is more work, commitment, time, sacrifice. Is a marriage work? Is it sacrifice? I can tell you from my point of view, it definitely is. Now, I'm going to say what I said last Sunday. I'm no expert at marriage. Andrew and I going to celebrate 50 years here in 6 months. Don't make me an expert, but I can go back to our first year of marriage when we decided that we would get married. She knew I had an assignment to, I was in the Air Force, she knew I had an assignment to the Philippines. And I said, well, we can wait or you can go. And she says, I'm going with you. She had never been on a plane before. She had never lived outside the state of Arkansas before. Definitely never been married before. Was there a sacrifice? Pack up her bags, leave mom and daddy, go 8,000 miles or 10,000, 8,000 miles away? When she landed at Clark Airplane Patch and that plane door opened, I don't know if it was trust or hope, but she wanted to see my face. I had to go in ahead of her. But for 2 years, and that was back in the day before cell phones, and we was too broke to make phone calls. Phone call from the Philippines at that time was $3 a minute. Had to save the phone calls for special occasions. Did try to use Mars once, but that was, if you're not used to that kind of communication, it's kind of difficult. Hello, hello, over. But she made sacrifices. So
Christians all regard divorce as something like cutting up a living body, as a kind of surgical operation. Some think that the operation is so violent that it cannot be done at all. Others admit that it is a desperate remedy in extreme cases. They are all agreed that it is more like having your legs cut off than it is like dissolving a business partnership or even deserting a regiment.
Was you in class last week? Okay, you was here then when I talked about that the bonding, the cleaving, the one, it's just like when something is welded, that if you try to unweld it, it's not coming apart at the same place. There's gonna be remnants from this side over here and vice versa, so it's never a clean cut. So a divorce does damage, period.
I'll stick this in here as a parent. We need to do our part of the lead to clean too. You gotta let it go, 'cause I'm assuming our parents weren't very happy with you taking her off their building. But they let you go.
Well, she was of age, so I don't know if they would have had a choice, but I'm quite sure that she would have listened to their influence. And I'm not saying that they were happy with me, but they didn't stand in the way. So, well, yes, sir.
This as far as the living together and things like that, we can look at nature. Nature, for the most part, there aren't those that mate for life. There are exceptions to it. But God has chosen, because we have reason and ability, and we have ability to make choices and decisions, that we are to be monogamous. There's to be that relationship that's for life. And we're not like the animals of the field.
That's correct.
Many people live that way.
And as we're got about 5 minutes left, as we get down then to the section that good reasons for virginity before marriage is God's way, you get down to all the problems that come up that we've been discussing, and one of those says in Revelation 21:8 that fornicators will be in hell. So as we come on down through here, if we get down to section E, fornication makes sex the goal rather than a byproduct of a committed and knowledgeable love. And I think that's what happens when people start living together before marriage. They're more interested in the physical than they are the committed companion relationship that takes place. And then it says that for those, it violates trust. It violates patience. It violates self-control. And it violates the future spouse, even if the same. I wanted to get down to that particular one. How does it violate the spouse, the future spouse, even if it's the one that you've been living with, according to God's plan?
Ephesians chapter 5, it says, no man can love himself without loving his wife. The disrespect that's there, you're involved in that relationship before marriage.
I think this is a verse I want to go to, 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Starting with verse 13. Meat's for the belly, and the belly for meat, but God shall destroy both it and them. Now the body is not for fornication, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And God hath both raised up the Lord, and will also raise us up by his own power. Know ye not that your bodies are the members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them the members of an harlot? God forbid. What? Know ye not that he which is joined to an harlot is one body, for two, saith he, shall be one flesh. But he that is joined unto the Lord is one spirit. Flee fornication. Every sin that a man doeth is without the body, But he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own body. What? Know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost which is in you, which ye have of God, and ye are not your own? For ye are bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. You see, when you're single, your body is the temple of God. If you violate God's law, you have not only desecrated your own body, but you've desecrated the body of the other. So we need to treat our bodies as God's temple, and that is why he says that you leave and cleave and become one. I have got to get that bell changed.
Well, at least it gets your attention.
It does get your attention.
Same thing is taught in Hebrews 13, which is marriage is honorable when death and defiled upon one of the adulterers God will judge. You can't change the simple fact of what he says.
That's correct. We can't change God's law. Thank y'all so much for your attention and comments.